The first thing I saw when I came home that afternoon was a red violation notice taped to the door of my workshop, and I knew right away somebody had decided they were more important than 120 years of my family's history. 3 days later, the neighborhood association fined me $2,500 and forced me to shut down the forge that had paid my bills for over a decade. What they didn't know was that the same decision they used to try to erase my craft would eventually cost them $47,000 and put their pride right where it belonged, in the hands of the person they looked down on. My name is Caleb Mercer. I'm 44 years old, and I come from a long line of blacksmiths in a small town outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. My grandfather used to tell me that iron remembers everything: the heat, the pressure, the hands that shaped it. Every mark tells a story. When I was a kid, I thought that sounded like something old men said to make their work seem important. But after everything that happened, I realized he wasn't talking about metal. He was talking about people. He was talking about respect. My workshop sat behind my house on land my family owned for generations. It wasn't some noisy factory throwing smoke into the sky. It was a small, clean building with proper ventilation, safety equipment, and tools that had been passed down through my family. I restored antique iron gates, made custom railings, and created memorial pieces for families who wanted something permanent to honor the people they loved. It was quiet work, honest work, and honestly, I never thought anyone would have a problem with it. That changed when Evelyn Harrow became president of the Cedar Brook Estates Association. Evelyn was the kind of person who walked into a room and expected everyone to notice. She always wore expensive clothes, carried a folder full of community rules, and had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a warning. The first time she visited my property, she stood outside my workshop looking around like she had discovered a crime scene. "Caleb, this setup isn't appropriate for a residential community," she said. I remember wiping my hands on my apron and looking behind me at the place where I had spent thousands of hours working. "It's a registered workshop, Evelyn. Everything is up to code." She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they think the conversation is already over. Codes change. Communities evolve. Sometimes people have to understand when something doesn't belong anymore. At the time, I let it go. I figured she just didn't like the look of a working forge near her perfect rows of freshly painted houses. But a few weeks later, I came home to that notice on my door. Violation of residential safety regulations. Unauthorized metalworking operation. Immediate shutdown order. The fine was $2,500. I stood there for a long time reading that paper, thinking maybe I had misunderstood something. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a conversation. This was someone trying to turn my entire livelihood into a line item on a spreadsheet. I had almost $9,000 worth of custom orders waiting. One was a memorial plaque for a firefighter's family. Another was a restoration project for a historic church. Those jobs weren't just money. They were promises I made to real people. When I went to the association office to fight it, Evelyn was sitting behind her desk like a judge waiting for someone to enter the courtroom. I brought my certifications, my inspection records, and photographs of my restoration work. I thought maybe if she saw the history behind what I did, she would understand. I was wrong. She barely looked at the papers. "Caleb, this isn't about your talent," she said. "It's about protecting property values." I laughed a little because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Protecting property values by shutting down someone who restores historic ironwork? She leaned back. "People pay to live here because they expect standards." That sentence stayed with me because I realized she wasn't seeing a person standing in front of her. She was seeing a problem to remove. "You can pay the fine and comply," she said, "or the association can take further action. In other words, pay up or prepare for a fight I couldn't afford." So I paid. I swallowed my pride, shut down the forge, and watched my clients take their projects somewhere else. One family drove nearly 3 hours to find another craftsman who could complete their memorial piece. I remember standing alone in my workshop that night, looking at the cold furnace and the tools hanging on the wall, wondering if maybe my grandfather had been wrong. Maybe iron didn't remember anything after all. But then I opened an old wooden box that had been sitting untouched in my closet for years. Inside was a collection of documents my grandfather left behind, including a faded land survey from 1903. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking for a loophole. I was just trying to understand how someone could push my family off land we had protected for generations. And when I unfolded that old document under the light, I saw something that made me stop breathing for a second. The property line wasn't where everyone thought it was. It extended much farther than the current neighborhood maps showed, and it ran directly underneath the one thing Cedarbrook Estates was most proud of. I stared at that old survey for what felt like an hour, tracing the faded ink with my finger, trying to convince myself I was reading it wrong. But I wasn't. The original boundary line for my family's deed extended nearly 20 feet farther than the records the association had been using for decades. And sitting right on that strip of land was the centerpiece of Cedarbrook Estates, the giant handcrafted iron entrance gate that every resident drove through every single day. That gate was the symbol Evelyn loved showing off whenever the association hosted events. She called it the crown jewel of the neighborhood. It was featured in their brochures, their website, even their community newsletters. They spent years telling everyone it represented the elegance and history of Cedarbrook Estates. The funny part was, the history they were celebrating was actually sitting on my family's land. I didn't feel happy when I discovered it. Not at first. I actually felt tired, because anyone who's ever been dragged into a fight with a powerful group knows the first feeling isn't victory. It's exhaustion. You start asking yourself if it's worth the stress, if you should just walk away, if maybe keeping the peace matters more than proving you're right. But then I thought about the way Evelyn looked at my workshop. I thought about how quickly she dismissed generations of craftsmanship as if it was just an eyesore, and I realized this was never only about a forge. It was about someone deciding whose history mattered and whose didn't. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a property attorney named Daniel Whitmore, a guy who had spent 30 years dealing with land disputes and knew how to read old documents better than anyone I had ever met. The second was to the county recorder's office to verify the original deed and boundary information. The third was to a structural engineer, because I wanted to know exactly what condition that famous gate was actually in. Daniel called me back later that afternoon after reviewing everything. His first words were simple. "Caleb, if these records are accurate, you have a serious claim." I asked him what that meant. He explained that decades earlier, my family had granted the neighborhood a temporary maintenance agreement allowing them to use and maintain the entrance gate. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't a permanent transfer. It was a 50-year easement, and according to the documents, that agreement had expired months earlier. For 50 years, the association had acted like they owned something they were only borrowing. They had forgotten the difference. And honestly, that was the part that bothered me the most. It wasn't that they used the gate. My family had allowed that. It wasn't that hundreds of families drove across the property every day. We had no problem with that. The problem was that they treated generosity like weakness. They treated a handshake from the past like permission to control the future. After Daniel confirmed everything, I didn't storm into Evelyn's office. I didn't make threats. I didn't hold a press conference. I did something much simpler. I followed the law. At midnight on a cold Tuesday night, I walked to that massive iron gate with a flashlight in one hand and a legal notice in the other. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every footstep. I attached the notice where everyone could see it. It stated that the original landowner was exercising property rights regarding maintenance and restoration of the historic structure. The next morning, Cedarbrook woke up to something they had never experienced before. They weren't the ones controlling the rules. They were the ones reading them. Of course, Evelyn was furious. She called me before lunch. "Caleb, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Her voice had that same confident tone from months earlier when she shut down my workshop. I calmly explained the situation. "I'm following the documents." She laughed. "You think an old piece of paper gives you control over our entrance?" I looked out at the gate while we talked. "Actually, Evelyn, I think 50 years of paperwork means exactly what it says." She went silent for a moment. Then came the threat. "You have no idea what kind of trouble you're creating." I smiled because it was almost the same sentence she had used on me before. Only this time, the situation had changed. "I think I understand trouble pretty well," I told her. "I've been dealing with it since the day you taped that violation notice to my door." She hung up. For several days, nothing happened. The residents continued driving through the gate. People whispered. Some thought I was being difficult. Others thought the association had finally met someone who wouldn't immediately back down. Then, on the third day, the problem nobody expected finally appeared. The gate started failing. The engineer I hired had warned me there were serious issues hidden beneath the surface. Decades of moisture exposure had weakened critical connection points. The association had painted over damage instead of repairing it because proper restoration would have been expensive. From the outside, the gate looked beautiful, From the inside, it was barely holding together. That morning, one of the central hinges cracked, and the entire structure shifted. It didn't collapse, but it leaned enough that everyone noticed. Traffic slowed. Cars lined up. Residents who once ignored the situation suddenly cared very much. And the same people who told me my work was unnecessary started asking a different question. Who can fix it? The association called local contractors. Nobody wanted the job. They called restoration companies across the state. Same answer. The reason was simple. This wasn't just a gate. It was a piece of historic ironwork built using techniques most modern fabricators didn't know anymore. The scroll patterns, the hand-forged details, the original construction style, it required someone who understood how craftsmen worked more than a century ago. After nearly 2 weeks of searching, they finally heard the answer they didn't want to hear. There was only one certified restoration specialist within hundreds of miles who could handle the project, and everyone knew his name, the same man they had fined, the same man they tried to shut down, me. When Evelyn showed up at my workshop on the 12th day, I almost didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. This was the same woman who had walked into my property months earlier with a clipboard in her hand and a look on her face like she was inspecting something that didn't belong. The same woman who stood behind her office desk and told me my family's craft was nothing more than a problem waiting to happen. But that morning, she wasn't carrying a violation notice. She wasn't talking about community standards. She wasn't threatening fines or legal action. She was standing in front of the very forge she wanted shut down, asking the person she tried to silence for help. And honestly, I think that's when the reality of the situation finally hit her. The gate wasn't just a structure. It was a piece of history. And the person who understood that history was the person she had spent months trying to push away. "Caleb," she said, looking uncomfortable for the first time since I met her, "we need you to repair the entrance gate." I didn't answer immediately, not because I wanted revenge, and not because I wanted to make her feel small. I just wanted to let that moment exist for a second. Sometimes people need to sit with the consequences of their own decisions. She had spent weeks telling me my work wasn't valuable. Now she was standing in my workshop because nobody else could do what I did. I reached into the drawer beside my workbench and pulled out my restoration agreement. I placed it on the table between us. "This is my rate," I said. "Emergency historic restoration. $1,200 a day, minimum 30 days, plus materials, equipment, and liability coverage." She looked down at the paper, then back at me. Her expression changed immediately. "You're serious?" she asked. I nodded. "Very." She picked up the contract and shook her head. "This is excessive." I almost smiled because I had heard that exact tone before. It was the same tone she used when she decided my entire career could be reduced to a safety violation. "Evelyn," I said, 6 months ago you told me professionals work in proper facilities. Now you're asking a professional to do specialized work. This is what that work costs." She looked frustrated. "You're taking advantage of a desperate situation." I looked through the window at the gate in the distance. "No. I'm charging the value of a skill you spent months telling everyone wasn't important." For once, she didn't have an answer. My attorney reviewed everything again after that meeting. It confirmed the property documents, the expired maintenance agreement, and my legal right to determine the terms of the restoration. The association could complain. They could be angry. They could hold meetings and argue about it. But they couldn't pretend the paperwork didn't exist. The funny thing was, the same rules they loved using against everyone else were now the rules protecting me. Over the next 30 days, I rebuilt that gate piece by piece. And I don't mean just fixing what people could see. I mean going underneath the surface and finding every mistake that had been ignored for years. I removed sections of damaged iron, repaired weakened connections, replaced failed components, and restored the old craftsmanship that made the gate special in the first place. There were moments when residents would stop by and watch me work. Some were curious, some were embarrassed, a few apologized. One older homeowner named Frank came by almost every morning with coffee. He told me, "You know, Caleb, I always thought the association handled things the right way. But watching you work out here, I realized we were about to lose something we didn't even understand." That meant more to me than the money, because that was the part Evelyn never understood. I wasn't fighting because I hated the neighborhood. I wasn't trying to destroy something. I was trying to protect something. There is a big difference. When the restoration was finally complete, the gate looked better than it had in decades. The iron curves were clean, the structure was stable, and the original details that had almost disappeared were brought back to life. At the center hinge, I placed my family's maker's mark, small enough that most people would miss it, but meaningful enough that I would always know it was there. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a punishment. It was simply proof that the person they tried to remove was the person who saved them. The final invoice came to just over $47,000. The association paid in full. But the bigger story started after that. During an emergency homeowners meeting, residents began asking questions. Why had the inspection reports been ignored? Why were repairs delayed? Why was everyone told the gate was perfectly fine when professionals had warned otherwise? Eventually, documents came out showing that Evelyn had been aware of the problems for years. She wasn't protecting the community. She was protecting the image of the community. She didn't want residents seeing cracks in the gate because she thought cracks made her leadership look weak. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She spent months searching for problems in my workshop while ignoring the biggest problems sitting right at the entrance of the neighborhood. A week later, Evelyn resigned. The same position she used to control people was gone. After that, the association approached me about a long-term maintenance agreement. They wanted me to become the official restoration specialist for the community, a 15-year contract. I accepted, but only after making one thing clear. A community isn't stronger because one person has the most authority. It's stronger because people respect each other. Rules have a purpose, but rules without fairness become weapons. And I think that's where everything went wrong from the beginning. Evelyn didn't see neighbors. She saw violations. She didn't see history. She saw inconvenience. She didn't see a cracksman. She saw someone she could order around. But sometimes the people we dismiss are the very people we end up needing the most. Today, when I drive past that entrance gate, I still smile a little. Not because I beat Evelyn, not because I got the money. I smile because every time that gate opens, it carries a piece of my family's story with it. The same story someone tried to erase. The forge is still running. The hammer is still hitting steel. And every now and then, someone from Cedarbrook Estates comes by and asks about the old tools hanging on my wall. They ask about my grandfather. They ask how I learned the craft. And I tell them the same thing he told me years ago. Iron remembers everything. It remembers the hands that shaped it, the pressure that tested it, and the people who thought they could break it but only made it stronger. Now I want to hear what you think. Was I right to charge the full restoration cost after the way the association treated me? Or should I have helped them without asking for anything in return? Was this a case of someone finally standing up for themselves, or did both sides take things too far? Leave your thoughts in the comments because these kinds of community battles aren't just about money or property. They're about respect, fairness, and what happens when ordinary people decide they aren't going to be pushed around anymore. And if you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who believes that experience, hard work, and integrity still matter.